Wealthy woman humiliates and fires elderly maid. But when she finds out who the maid really is, she's in shock. The glow of the golden chandeliers lit up the spotless marble floors of the mansion, but Clara's heart was wrapped in darkness. Accustomed to luxury, she saw nothing beyond what her money could buy. The antique clock on the wall ticked steadily, marking the oppressive silence of the house. Dona Rosa, with her wrinkled hands and tired eyes, swept the floor as she had done for years. For Clara, it was just another ordinary morning. But for Dona Rosa, this day would mark the end of a long journey. A small incident, a spilled coffee stain, ignited Clara's fury. "How dare you be so incompetent?" she yelled, not even looking the elderly woman in the eye. With the cruel sound of her voice, fate began weaving an invisible thread that would change everything. Clara always woke up early, not because she enjoyed feeling the morning sun or hearing the birds in her lush garden, but because her routine was meticulously timed. For her, time was money. As Clara descended the stairs with firm steps, her heels echoing through the house, the staff was already moving to meet her demands. The mansion was vast, and the faces of the employees were lost in the crowd of people Clara barely recognized. Dona Rosa, one of the oldest maids in the house, had been there even before Clara inherited her family's fortune. Despite the years of service, Clara had never truly seen her. To the millionaire, Dona Rosa was nothing more than an invisible figure handling the simplest and least important tasks. Her white hair and tired posture showed her advanced age, but Dona Rosa always maintained silence and dedication. That morning, Clara, with a blank expression and her cell phone in hand, was heading toward the kitchen. Her eyes were fixed on the stock market numbers and graphs, her mind absorbed in business strategies. But then something seemingly insignificant took her focus. A small coffee stain on the Persian rug that adorned the hallway. "Who did this?" she shouted, her cold voice echoing through the house. Dona Rosa, who was cleaning the floor nearby, looked up and hesitated before approaching. Her heart was pounding in her chest. She knew this wouldn't end well. "I'm sorry, Miss Clara. I must have spilled it when I brought your coffee." Clara turned to face the elderly woman. Her eyes, once distracted by business, now narrowed in disdain. "Incompetent. I pay you to do things right, and you can't even manage that? This rug costs more than you'll ever make in years of work." Dona Rosa lowered her eyes, Clara's words cutting through her like knives. She knew she had made a mistake, but Clara's rage was disproportionate. I'll clean it right away, ma'am," she murmured, her voice trembling. But Clara wasn't interested in apologies. Her patience had run out. "Enough. You're fired. Pack your things and get out of my house now." The words were delivered with devastating coldness, as if Clara were discarding a useless object. Dona Rosa froze. She had worked in that house for over 40 years, dedicating her life to serving without complaint. She knew every corner of the mansion, every secret of its residents. Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't dare protest. She bowed slightly, in a humble gesture of acceptance, and slowly made her way to the servants' quarters to pack her few belongings. Clara, for her part, turned away without looking back, already returning to her business world, satisfied that she had solved the problem. To her, the day continued as usual, with no consequences. Little did she know that this act of disdain would change her life in ways she could never imagine. The sound of Dona Rosa's slow footsteps echoed through the empty hallway as she left the mansion. In her hands, only a small bag of personal belongings, the result of decades of invisible dedication. Every corner of that house held a story, a fragment of memory that connected her to that family. But at that moment, she felt like a stranger. The humiliation still burned on her skin, but something deeper than wounded pride weighed on her heart. As Dona Rosa left, she paused briefly at the mansion's gate. She looked one last time at the place where she had spent much of her life. Her gaze, however, wasn't one of anger or sadness. It was one of resignation. There was something Clara never knew, something she might never be able to understand. Before we start the story, I'd like to know what city you're watching from. Tell me in the comments, and I'll leave a heart for you. Clara, on the other hand, was oblivious to the depth of that farewell. Sitting in her luxurious office, she flipped through papers, preparing for another important meeting. In her mind, Dona Rosa's dismissal was just an insignificant detail, something that would be quickly resolved with the hiring of another maid. Her personal assistant, always attentive, was already looking for replacements. "I don't need incompetent people slowing me down," she muttered as she signed a contract. However, as the hours passed, a strange feeling began to creep over Clara. There was something in the way Dona Rosa had reacted, something in her silent and dignified posture, that disturbed Clara. It was as if the elderly maid knew something that she didn't, as if there were a hidden story behind those tired eyes. Later that afternoon, Clara decided to take a break. She leaned back in her leather chair, and her thoughts wandered to past moments. She vaguely remembered Dona Rosa from her childhood. The woman had always been there, silent and present. But why had she never known anything about her personal life? Who was Dona Rosa, really? These thoughts began to unsettle her. Back at her modest apartment, which she called home, Dona Rosa sat in her old armchair, physically and emotionally exhausted. She pulled out a box of old photos she cherished. In one of the pictures, she was young, holding a baby in her arms. Next to her, an elegant and smiling woman watched the scene. That woman was Clara's mother. Dona Rosa took a deep breath. Time had passed, and many secrets had been buried over the years, but the cycle of fate seemed inevitable. That moment she had long feared had finally come. The memories flooded back like an avalanche. Clara's childhood, the difficult decisions, and the sacrifices she made to protect that family. As Clara dined alone that night, her phone rang. It was a message from an old friend of her mother's, someone she hadn't heard from in a long time. Curious, she answered. "Clara dear, I heard you fired Dona Rosa. There's something you need to know about her. Not over the phone. It's urgent. Can we meet tomorrow?" Clara's heart raced. Why would anyone care so much about a simple maid? There was a shadow of mystery in her mother's friend's voice. Clara knew this wasn't a coincidence. Suddenly, what seemed like just another ordinary day in her busy life was turning into something much bigger. Unbeknownst to her, Clara was about to discover a secret that would challenge everything she thought she knew about her own story. And the shock would be impossible to ignore. The next day, Clara woke up with a strange sense of unease. Her mother's friend's call hadn't left her mind. Why would anyone care so much about a fired maid? Once again, memories of Dona Rosa surfaced, a constant but distant presence in her life. Clara had never thought of her as anything more than an employee. But now, doubt gnawed at her. After a rushed morning of back-to-back meetings, Clara finally made her way to the cafe where she was supposed to meet Helena, her mother's friend. When she arrived, Helena was already there, sitting by a window, holding a cup of tea in her trembling hands. "Clara dear, it's been so long," Helena said with a tense smile, though her eyes showed concern. Clara sat down across from her, impatient. "Helena, what is all this about? I really don't understand why you're so worried about a maid." Helena sighed deeply, placing her teacup down. "It's not just about a maid, Clara. It's about your family. There's so much you don't know." Clara crossed her arms, skeptical. "My family? What does that have to do with Dona Rosa?" Helena looked at Clara with a grave expression, as if weighing her words carefully. "Dona Rosa wasn't just a maid. She's been with your family since before you were born. Do you remember how distant your mother was? How she spent long periods traveling and being involved with the family business? Who was always there for you?" Clara tried to recall, but her childhood memories were vague. She had always thought she was raised by nannies and housekeepers, but had never gotten attached to any of them. "Yes, but that's normal in families like ours," Clara replied defensively. Helena shook her head. "Your mother trusted Dona Rosa more than anyone else. She was by your side from day one, Clara, and not just as an employee. She has a much deeper connection to you." Clara's eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about, Helena? What kind of connection?" Helena hesitated, but knew she could no longer hide the truth. Dona Rosa is your real grandmother, Clara." The impact of those words made Clara's heart race. For a moment, she was in shock, as if the world around her had stopped. That doesn't make any sense. My grandmother died when I was a child. How could—" "Yes, Clara, the woman you believe to be your grandmother passed away when you were young. But the story is much more complicated. Your grandfather, before marrying the grandmother who passed away, had a relationship with a working-class woman. That woman was Dona Rosa. They loved each other deeply, but due to social pressures and family expectations, he left her to marry another woman. The one you always thought was your real grandmother, an heiress from a powerful family. Dona Rosa, pregnant at the time, had her child, your father, and he was raised far from the family's prestige." Clara, stunned, shook her head, refusing to believe it. "But why did no one ever tell me this? Why didn't she say anything?" Helena looked at Clara with a sad expression. "Because your grandfather, despite everything, never wanted to officially acknowledge Dona Rosa as part of the family. She accepted working for your family in silence to be close to you. She did it out of love for you, to ensure that in some way, she could care for her granddaughter, even if you never knew who she really was." Clara's shock deepened with every word. She remembered Dona Rosa caring for her during her early years, her silent but constant presence. The image of the elderly maid being humiliated and fired by Clara herself now weighed heavily on her chest. "This can't be true. I treated her so horribly. How could I?" Helena gently held Clara's hand, squeezing it softly. "You didn't know, Clara, but now you do. Dona Rosa never wanted you to find out like this. She always wanted to protect you and your grandfather's memory. But maybe it's time for you to understand everything that happened." Still in a state of shock, Clara felt tears welling up in her eyes. The thought that she had treated her own grandmother with such disdain was unbearable. "Where is she now?" Clara asked, her voice trembling. "I need to see her." Helena smiled sadly. "She went back to her home outside the city. But, Clara, you need to be ready to face her. She loves you. She always has, even though you never knew." Clara stood up, determined, but with a heart heavy with regret. She knew she needed to make things right, and now, her life no longer felt the same. A decades-old secret had finally been revealed, and its impact would change everything. Clara drove along the winding road leading to the modest neighborhood where Dona Rosa lived. The trees blurred in a rush of colors as the scenery around her changed dramatically. The road, once lined with mansions and luxurious properties, now became more humble and neglected, a reflection of the life Clara had ignored for so long. Her heart pounded in her chest. She thought about the encounter ahead and how she would explain her cruel behavior. How could she apologize to someone who had sacrificed so much for her without ever asking for anything in return? The guilt consumed her, and the regret was like a knife in her conscience. When she arrived at Dona Rosa's house, Clara parked in front of the rusted iron gate. The house was small but well kept, surrounded by a little garden where flowers bloomed despite the simplicity. Clara hesitated before getting out of the car, taking a deep breath. Every step she took toward the door felt like an immense weight, as if her legs resisted the guilt she felt. She knocked on the door, and the sound echoed softly, yet laden with anxiety. After a few moments, the door slowly opened, revealing Dona Rosa. The elderly woman seemed even more fragile than Clara remembered, her face marked by time, but with a peaceful expression, though she looked surprised. "Miss Clara," said Dona Rosa, her voice low and gentle, but with a hint of surprise and caution. Clara struggled to keep her composure. I need to talk to you, Dona Rosa," she said, her voice trembling. "May I come in?" Dona Rosa hesitated for a moment, but opened the door and gestured for Clara to enter. The inside of the house was simple but cozy. Old photographs decorated the walls, memories of a life Clara never knew. The sense of nostalgia and regret filled the air, making Clara even more tense. The two sat at the small kitchen table, where Dona Rosa offered some tea. Clara accepted, but her hands trembled as she held the cup. I don't even know where to start," Clara said, the words heavy in her mouth. "Helena told me who you really are, and I—" Dona Rosa interrupted her with a sad but understanding look. "This wasn't how I wanted you to find out, my dear. I never wanted you to carry the weight of this truth." "But why?" Clara asked, unable to hold back the tears now welling up in her eyes. "Why didn't you ever tell me? Why did you endure all of this in silence? Working as a maid in your own family's home, being treated like someone of no importance." Dona Rosa looked at Clara with tenderness, her eyes tired but filled with silent wisdom. "Because it was the choice I made. I knew your father could never acknowledge me publicly, not without ruining everything he and your mother had built. He loved me, Clara, but the world he lived in was cruel, and I accepted that. When he married your mother, I decided that if I couldn't be your grandmother openly, at least I could be near you. And that was enough for me." Clara sat in silence, Dona Rosa's words resonating deeply in her heart. All the contempt she had shown, all the cruelty with which she had treated her, now seemed even more painful. She felt the weight of shame grow inside her. "I was horrible to you," Clara finally said, her voice choked with emotion. "I humiliated you, treated you as if you had no value. All while you loved me, while you sacrificed your own dignity to stay close to me. I'll never forgive myself for that." Dona Rosa reached out her wrinkled hand and gently touched Clara's. "We all make mistakes, my dear. I've known you since you were a child, and I know deep down you have a good heart. What matters is what you'll do from now on." Clara wept openly, feeling like a child again, seeking comfort in the arms of a maternal figure who had always been by her side. "I want to make things right. I want to help you, give you the place you deserve in our family." Dona Rosa smiled, but shook her head. "It's not money I need, Clara. I've lived my life the way I chose. What I want is for you to live yours with more heart, less haste, and less judgment. Remember who you really are and what truly matters." Dona Rosa's words penetrated deep into Clara's soul, opening wounds and healing others. At that moment, Clara realized that the true value of life wasn't in power, money, or prestige, but in the human connection she had ignored for so long. Dona Rosa had forgiven her, and that was a gift Clara never thought she deserved. But there was much to be done. Clara knew that the path to redemption wouldn't be easy, and the scars of her past actions still needed time to heal. But for the first time in a long while, Clara felt she was on the right path. After spending hours in Dona Rosa's small house, Clara left with an even heavier heart, but with newfound clarity about what she needed to do. The road back to the mansion seemed longer and filled with meanings she had never noticed before. Now, every choice she had made in life, the selfishness, the haste, the disdain for the people around her, appeared before her eyes as accusing shadows. Upon arriving home, Clara couldn't help but compare the immense wealth in which she lived to the dignified simplicity of Dona Rosa's life. For the first time, the golden walls and luxuries that had once comforted her now seemed cold and empty. She walked through the silent halls of the mansion, reflecting on the years she had spent obsessed with status and power, forgetting the people who truly mattered. The first thing Clara knew she had to do was face her own family. The next day, she called a meeting with the lawyers and shareholders of the company she had inherited from her parents. Deep down, she knew it would be a difficult confrontation, but something inside her had changed. She was no longer willing to continue with the coldness that had governed her life until then. Sitting at the head of the table, Clara looked at the familiar faces of the board members, all used to her ruthless style of doing business. "I invited you all here today because I'm making some important changes," she began, her voice firm, but with a vulnerability she had never shown before. One of the shareholders, an older and stern man named Mr. Vasconcelos, leaned forward, intrigued. "Changes? What do you mean by that, Clara?" "The company is doing very well under your leadership." Clara took a deep breath, feeling the weight of expectations on her shoulders. "I know the company is doing well financially. But the truth is, in the process of becoming this leader you all admire, I lost myself. I lost my empathy, my ability to see the value in people. I made cruel decisions, all in the name of profit and prestige. That has to change." Murmurs of discomfort spread around the table. Clara knew many of them wouldn't understand right away. The corporate coldness that reigned there wouldn't be easy to break. "I'm here to say that the era of disdain and exploitation in our management is over. We will treat our employees and partners with respect and dignity. We can no longer live as if money is the only thing that matters." Mr. Vasconcelos looked at Clara with a raised eyebrow, challenging her. "This all sounds very nice, Clara, but you know as well as I do that the company won't survive on sentimentality. We need strong leadership, rational decisions, not emotional outbursts." Clara held his gaze. "I'm not talking about sentimentality, Mr. Vasconcelos. I'm talking about ethical change. And if you can't see that, then this meeting was just the beginning of the changes to come." The shareholders exchanged uncertain glances. Clara knew she would face resistance, but she was prepared to fight. For the first time, she didn't care about being seen as vulnerable. She knew this was the first step toward a deeper transformation, not just of the company, but of herself. After the meeting, Clara felt a strange relief, as if a layer of her old life had been peeled away. She knew the path would be long, but she was ready to deal with the consequences of her decisions. The next day, Clara returned to see Dona Rosa, this time with a proposal. In Dona Rosa's small garden, Clara sat beside the elderly woman, watching her as she tended to her flowers. "Dona Rosa," Clara began, with a softer expression on her face, "I need your help. I want to make things right, and not just with you." Dona Rosa looked at Clara curiously. "What do you have in mind, my dear?" Clara took a deep breath. "I want you to come back to the mansion, but this time, not as an employee. I want you to be recognized for who you really are. I want you by my side as my grandmother. And more than that, I want to learn from you. I know you have much more to teach me than I've ever realized." Dona Rosa, surprised, smiled gently, her eyes filled with tenderness. "Ah, Clara, you don't need to do anything for me. What I really wanted was for you to find your own peace. And it seems you're on the way to that. I won't insist, Dona Rosa, if you don't want to come back. But know that the doors of my house will always be open for you. And I won't treat you as invisible anymore. You have a place in my life, and I want you to know that." Dona Rosa held Clara's hand, squeezing it kindly. "I've always been here, Clara, and I always will be. But seeing you find your way is enough for me." Clara smiled, moved. She knew Dona Rosa's forgiveness was genuine, but at the same time, she felt she still had much to learn from the woman who had silently cared for her all her life. The two sat there in silence, surrounded by the simple and beautiful garden, where each flower seemed to tell a story of sacrifice, love, and redemption. In the days that followed her conversation with Dona Rosa, Clara dove into a deep spiral of introspection. The nights became longer, and sleep a distant reality. The revelation that Dona Rosa was her true grandmother shook the foundations of her identity, leaving her lost in a whirlwind of emotions and questions. She wondered how, for so many years, she had lived under a false perception of herself and her own story. Her choices, her values, everything seemed to have been built on a foundation of lies and secrets. While Dona Rosa didn't move back to the mansion right away, Clara began to visit her small house almost daily, seeking answers and, above all, trying to understand the past that had never been revealed to her. Each visit brought her closer to the woman she now recognized not just as a grandmother, but as the maternal figure who had always silently accompanied her. Dona Rosa, for her part, showed infinite patience with Clara. She sat beside her granddaughter in the little garden or the modest living room, and together, they drank tea while having long conversations about the past. Clara asked questions she had never dared to ask as a child, and Dona Rosa answered with the wisdom of someone who had experienced both suffering and joy and who had long accepted her fate. "Why didn't you ever leave that house?" Clara asked one afternoon, her voice filled with anguish. "You could have left, Started your life over somewhere else, far from all of that. Why did you stay?" Dona Rosa smiled softly, her eyes shining with a tenderness Clara still struggled to fully understand. "I stayed because I wanted to be close to you. When you were born, Clara, I saw your grandfather in your eyes. I saw the man he could have been if circumstances had been different. But I knew he could never fully live the life he wanted. So, I resigned myself. I accepted what life offered me and did what I could to be near you, even if it was as a maid. The love I have for you never demanded recognition or rewards. Just being able to care for you is enough." Those words touched Clara deeply, but also filled her with a suffocating sense of injustice. She couldn't accept that Dona Rosa had been relegated to a life of servitude just to stay close to her and her father. She felt guilty, almost responsible, for the suffering her grandmother had endured in silence. However, their conversations revealed much more. Clara began to understand the nuances that shaped her family's story. Dona Rosa spoke of her romance with Clara's grandfather with affection and nostalgia, but also with a bitter acceptance of the forces that had separated them. Through her grandmother's words, Clara saw a more complex and tragic portrait of her grandfather, a man torn between love and duty, between passion and the social pressures that pushed him toward a life of conventions. "Your grandfather," Dona Rosa began one rainy afternoon, while Clara curled up near the fireplace in the small living room, "wasn't a man without a heart. He loved me deeply, but he was weak in the face of his family's demands. He married your other grandmother because it was what was expected of him, not because he wanted to, but that never changed the love he felt for me. He visited me in secret during the early years of his marriage until the visits began to dwindle." Clara swallowed hard, feeling a knot tighten in her throat. "Your grandfather was a proud man, but he was also afraid. He feared losing the respect of society, feared tarnishing the family name, and most of all, he feared his mother. She was a powerful and controlling woman, and even though he loved her, she never allowed anything to deviate from the plan she had made for him. Your father never knew I was his mother. Everything was arranged so that this secret would never be told." Clara knew her great-grandmother had always been a figure of authority in the family, but she had never seen her in this light before. She had always thought of her as a strong woman, but now she realized that this strength had, in many moments, been wielded as a form of emotional tyranny over those around her, especially over her grandfather. The anger boiled inside her, not just for the life of servitude imposed on Dona Rosa, but also for her grandfather's lack of courage in never fighting for what truly mattered. Clara found herself lost in a labyrinth of feelings. What she needed most was a path to redemption, to make amends not only for what she had done to Dona Rosa, but also for her family's legacy. One morning, after another sleepless night, she decided it was time to do more than just talk and make promises. She returned to the mansion, where she prepared a letter of temporary resignation from her leadership position at the family company. She needed time to reflect and to do something more meaningful with her life. She would leave the business in the hands of the board, but under the condition that the reforms she had begun would continue. She needed to find a greater purpose than just accumulating wealth. Her next decision was to surprise Dona Rosa with a trip. Clara didn't reveal their destination until they arrived, a small town in the countryside where Dona Rosa had grown up and lived. The car ride was long and quiet, but not uncomfortable. It was as if both needed that time to absorb everything they had discussed. When they arrived, Clara saw the nostalgic gleam in Dona Rosa's eyes as she recognized the landscape. "This place, I never thought I'd return here," the elderly woman murmured, looking at the distant mountains and cobbled streets. Clara parked near a modest house covered in ivy and surrounded by a wild yet beautiful garden. "This is your childhood home, isn't it?" Clara asked, trying to hide the emotion in her voice. Dona Rosa nodded, her eyes glistening with tears. "Yes, this is where I grew up with my parents. It was here that I met your grandfather many years ago. Everything started here." Clara felt that by bringing Dona Rosa back to that place, she was closing a cycle, but also beginning another. They walked together through the village, where Dona Rosa reunited with old acquaintances and saw that, despite the time that had passed, some things remained the same. Her grandmother's expression softened, and she seemed to finally be reconciling with her own past. That night, back at the small house where they were staying, Clara felt it was the right time to ask the question that had been forming in her mind since all of this began. Dona Rosa, I've always wondered something. If my grandfather really loved you so much, why didn't he fight for you? Why didn't he leave everything to be with you and my father? Did he have that choice? Dona Rosa looked deeply into Clara's eyes, as if deciding whether or not to reveal a painful truth. After a long silence, she said, he did have that choice, yes. But your grandfather, he chose the easier path. It was more convenient for him to keep me in the shadows and fulfill his family's expectations. I never judged him for it, but I also never deluded myself. He did what he thought was right, but not what his heart truly desired. Clara sat in silence, absorbing the harsh truth. That night, Clara reflected on her own life. She saw herself mirrored in her grandfather's choices, someone who had also taken the easier path, accumulating wealth and power without ever looking at those who truly mattered. But now, with Dona Rosa by her side, she finally understood the value of love, sacrifice, and repentance. It was there, in that small town where everything began, that Clara decided her journey of redemption wouldn't end with words or promises. She would do more than that. She would truly honor her grandmother's legacy and create something that reflected the values Dona Rosa had taught her. A life project that involved helping people, respecting their stories, and contributing to a fairer and less unequal world. As she looked up at the moon illuminating the sky over that small town, Clara felt, for the first time in years, that she was at peace with herself. There was no longer the relentless pursuit of external validation or the need to amass wealth. All that mattered now was living with empathy and purpose. Dona Rosa, who had fallen asleep beside her on the couch, looked more serene than ever. Clara gazed at her with tenderness and whispered, I will honor you, Grandma. I will honor you as I should have from the start. And so, after years of blindness and selfishness, Clara finally began to walk the path of redemption. She knew the journey would be long, but now, at least, she wouldn't be alone. Months passed since Clara had brought Dona Rosa back to her childhood town. In that journey, both had made peace with the past, understood the difficult choices, and acknowledged the sacrifices that had shaped their lives. Now, the focus was no longer on the wounds left behind, but on what they would build together from that point on. Over time, Clara invited Dona Rosa to move permanently into the mansion. At first, the elderly woman hesitated. Used to the simplicity of her modest life, she felt uncomfortable with the idea of returning to the house where she had served for decades as a maid. However, Clara insisted, not just as a request, but as a proposal of partnership and an offer of love. I don't want you to come back, just as my grandmother in name, Clara said one sunny afternoon as they walked through the mansion's gardens. I want you to be here, truly as part of the family. There will no longer be any division between what is yours and what is mine. This house, this legacy, is as much yours as it is mine. Dona Rosa looked at Clara, her eyes brimming with tears, but with a smile of gratitude. You've changed, my dear. I never imagined I'd see this transformation in you. But it's an enormous pride to see the woman you're becoming. With the decision made, Dona Rosa finally moved into the mansion. Her old servant's room, located at the back of the house, was replaced by a suite on the main floor, near Clara's room. The change in status was more than physical. It was symbolic. Dona Rosa was now a legitimate part of the house, occupying the place she had always deserved. Clara, for her part, began making significant changes in the way she managed both the house and her business. The first step was to change the dynamic with the staff. In the past, Clara barely bothered to know them, treating them coldly, as if they were invisible. But after what had happened with Dona Rosa, she realized that each of these people had a story, a life, dreams, and struggles that needed to be acknowledged. In a gesture that surprised everyone, Clara decided to gather all the mansion's employees in the grand hall. They expected orders, as usual, but were met with something completely different. "I want to start by apologizing," Clara said, her voice firm but filled with humility. "I've failed many of you. For years, I treated you as if you weren't important, as if your lives existed only to serve me. That was wrong, and I'm committed to changing that." The employees looked at each other in disbelief. Many didn't know how to react, used to Clara's distant and cold behavior. But her words didn't stop there. She continued, explaining how she had rediscovered the value of people, how Dona Rosa's story had transformed her, and how she wanted each person in that house to feel valued, not just as an employee, but as a human being. That day, Clara implemented a series of changes: fair wages, flexible hours, and above all, a new work environment where everyone was treated with respect. She made it a point to learn each person's name, spoke with them, listened to their needs and difficulties. It wasn't a quick process, but over time, Clara realized that these small gestures of empathy and recognition created an atmosphere of joy and loyalty in the mansion that she had never experienced before. Dona Rosa watched everything closely, proud of her granddaughter. She became a sort of informal mentor to Clara, helping her maintain sensitivity and humanity in dealing with others. Although her advanced age limited her energy, Dona Rosa remained involved behind the scenes, always ready to offer advice and ensure that Clara didn't fall back into the traps of ego and power. Together, they began working on an even larger project. Inspired by her grandmother's story, Clara decided to create a foundation that would help elderly people who, like Dona Rosa, had spent their lives working invisibly, without recognition or opportunities for growth. The foundation, named Casa Rosa, would be a refuge for elderly people who had dedicated their lives to service, offering them financial, psychological, and above all, dignified support. Dona Rosa, moved by the idea, helped Clara outline the foundation's objectives. They visited nursing homes, spoke with professionals in the field, and studied ways to create programs that not only provided financial aid, but also rescued the stories and memories of those whom society often forgets. "Everyone has a story," Dona Rosa would say during one of the meetings with the foundation's organizers. "And those stories deserve to be told, preserved, respected. We can't let these lives fade into anonymity, as if they had never existed." Casa Rosa became a success. Over time, it expanded its services, offering cultural activities, courses, and opportunities for social integration for the elderly. Clara and Dona Rosa attended every inauguration event, with Clara always crediting her grandmother as the inspiration. Over the months, Clara began receiving letters from people whose lives had been touched by the foundation. These were stories of transformed lives, of elderly individuals who, after decades of hard and often undervalued work, were finally finding renewed meaning in their lives. Every letter Clara read moved her deeply, and she knew more than ever that she had found her true purpose. The relationship between Clara and Dona Rosa also blossomed in an unexpected way. The dynamic of employer and employee had completely disappeared, giving way to a genuine and affectionate relationship between grandmother and granddaughter. Together, they shared not only the responsibilities of the foundation, but also simple and precious moments that had been stolen by life. Conversations over breakfast, laughter in the garden, quiet afternoons of reading side by side. The mansion staff, once distant and fearful, now became part of this new family dynamic. Clara made sure to include them in celebrations and to create an environment where everyone felt part of something bigger. The house, once a fortress of luxury and coldness, now became a home where human warmth was the greatest wealth. There was one special afternoon when Clara prepared a surprise for Dona Rosa. Along with the staff, they organized a garden party at the mansion to celebrate her grandmother's 80th birthday. There were flowers, music, and smiles everywhere. But the most touching moment was when Clara stepped onto a small makeshift stage and, in front of everyone, gave a speech. "Today we celebrate not only the birthday of an incredible woman, but the presence of someone who, in silence, changed all of our lives," Clara began, tears in her eyes. "Dona Rosa is more than a grandmother to me. She's an example of strength, resilience, and unconditional love. Everything I am today, I owe to her, and everything we'll do in the future will be in her honor." Dona Rosa, sitting at the center of the celebration, could hardly contain her tears of emotion. She had never imagined, in her years of silent service, that one day she would be recognized and loved in this way. She felt that her sacrifice had not been in vain and that, finally, life had returned to her what she deserved. As Clara embraced her under the blue sky of that afternoon, surrounded by friends, staff, and foundation partners, Dona Rosa whispered, "You've honored me in a way I never imagined. Now, dear, it's your turn to carry on the legacy. The world needs more people like you." Clara smiled, holding her grandmother's hand tightly. She knew that the journey of transformation hadn't been easy, but fate had given them the opportunity to rebuild everything together. And now, with a heart full of purpose, Clara was ready to continue what they had started, knowing that Dona Rosa would always be by her side as a living inspiration of love, courage, and dignity. The future they built together was bright, not because of luxury or material possessions, but because they had finally understood that the true value of life lay in human connections, respect, and the legacy they would leave for the generations to come. If this story of transformation, love, and redemption touched your heart, don't forget to like the video. Share it with someone you love who might also be inspired. And of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more impactful stories like this one. Every like and subscription helps us keep bringing content that touches the heart. See you in the next video.